This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite folklore, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Tamika Thompson about her collection, UNSHOD, Cackling, and Naked. Tamika Thompson is a writer, producer, and journalist. Her writing has been published by or is forthcoming in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Huffington Post, among others. Tamika was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, and she currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her husband and 2 children. Tamika, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tamika, the first thing that sort of strikes me about your work is that you have a background in journalism.
It's a bit of a circuitous path that I took to horror writing. And I was into horror from a very young age, but I also went to Catholic school, and my mother had me in pageants and acting and modeling. And I went off to college and studied political science. And then I went to journalism school and worked as a journalist. And it wasn't until I had my daughter that I decided that I wanted to write stories. And I was able to pull on all of the things that I had been doing my entire life. You know, the horror, I noticed that when I started writing, all of the short stories were very dark. I was able to pull on my performance background, my media background, and the political science and the journalism. A lot of my work is based on horrors that are in the news or social horrors. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking to create conversation around that and bring those to life.
So aside from the content, because I think these days it's pretty obvious that any straight reporting of the facts amounts to a horror story, how has the style of journalism influenced the way you write, or at least shape your stories?
The prose itself is very much how I learned to write when I was in graduate school. We were writing for the ear because I was a broadcast journalist.
Oh,
we were not, our unit was not for newspapers. We studied that part of it, but I really learned to write for radio and for television. When I was in graduate school, I actually worked at a radio station in Cape Town, South Africa. And when I came out, I worked in television. And so the writing is very muscular. It's very verb centric. It uses very few adjectives and adverbs. And it's very much, subject, verb, object, because you're trying to relay the facts as simply as you can for the widest audience that you can. And so there's very little florid writing. The writing is beautiful and evocative a lot of times, but you're not going to get the same type of florid prose that you would from other places. And so I think that's carried over into my work. The research that I do for my stories and for my novel that's coming out next year very much was reporting. Mm-hmm. Because, not only was I gathering facts and data, but I was interviewing people and hearing voices and understanding stories that were important to the people that I was speaking to, so that when I created the characters, they were never really based on one person, but the totality of all of that reporting that I had done. Mm-hmm. And I think it comes across in the work because I think the work can really be read by anyone. I don't feel that I'm writing for the ivory tower. I feel that I am writing for the people who were in my family when I was growing up, the working class, the bus drivers and the factory workers and, the typists who, back when they had typists who worked in the offices, but maybe on their commute on the bus home wanted a good story to read. So I think that comes across in the work.
It does. It's so interesting that you write for the ear, but it's also sort of result oriented. And it's really about transmitting the action and the information as efficiently as possible, which is its own style. There's a lot of prose writers that do have that very spare style that does so many wonderful things. It has so many knock-on effects because you don't get slowed down by unnecessary description. You are getting inundated with the information of the situation, and sometimes you can offset the sort of more uncanny or supernatural or absurdly terrifying emotions by this just the facts spare metronome. It's really cool the way you've channeled that journalism training into horror. Have any of your stories been adapted to audio?
Yes, I actually had a story that was not in the collection that was picked up by the Creepy podcast.
Mm.
And they had a narrator do the narration for it. And it was a fun experience when I wrote it. I did not initially write it for an audio podcast, but I took my story and I adapted it
Okay.
before I sent it to them because I wanted it to sound a certain way. I wanted it to sound creepy. I wanted it to sound creepy for the Creepy podcast.
Sure.
By I ended up removing a lot of description, to be honest. And I kept action and I kept, very short thoughts. And I kept, obviously the dialogue because I love dialogue so much. And I think that actually comes from my performance background, stage acting, and just loving the back and forth and what goes unsaid. And so I initially wrote that story and kind of put it aside. I didn't really send it anywhere. But when I decided that I wanted to send it to Creepy, I said, oh, I think I can do this. I've been writing for the ears. I can definitely do this. And it was wonderfully narrated.
It must have been nice to sort of bring it full circle to go from learning about writing for the ear and then writing something to be performed and then hearing it adapted.
Yes. I mean, and it's tough because everything has to be short. It was like that for television. We would be assigned a story, but we had to do it in less than a minute. We had to do an entire news story in like 45 seconds and be able to convey all of the facts, all of the characters, all sides, but then also the emotion of the story as well. And the nugget that the viewer or listener needed to walk away with. And so the first thing that I did with the story when I adapted it for Creepy was I cut it down. Like it had to be short. And I think that writing for television, for radio, for podcasts, it creates the need for different muscles in your writing than writing for print.
Let's explore your collection, UNSHOD, Cackling, and Naked, which is pretty short and punchy right there. It's a good example of what we're in for. I noticed on your personal site, you describe yourself as a horror and suspense author.
Yes.
And I feel like suspense is a underutilized aspect of horror in a lot of the stuff that I encounter. Can you talk a bit about suspense?
I think suspense is a great term that doesn't get used a lot, and I'm not sure why. I think that suspense covers so many genres, from horror to thrillers. Even literary works have suspense, mystery, crime stories. I just feel like suspense can cover so many things, and I've always wondered why people don't use that more often. But I think even more so than being a horror writer, I think a suspense writer probably describes what I write, because everything that I do is not horror and everything that I do is not speculative. And so I really love that term because the idea that it conveys is that the reader is held in suspense. The reader is on the edge of their seat. The reader is following along with the protagonist, but they really feel as if they are in the story themselves and that they're wanting to continue to move through this journey with them. And sometimes the journey, like in more literary works, is not as propulsive. But I think in everything that I write, there's some kernel of either mystery or weirdness. That's like my favorite. When someone tells me that story was really weird, I feel like I have accomplished something. But there's some level of uncertainty that carries the reader through the story, whether it's short or longer, where they hopefully don't want to put it down. And so I think that's probably a better way to describe what I'm attempting, at least.
I think it's ironic that you have this journalism background, and then if you're writing suspense, it's all about not answering questions or giving information that just brings up more questions. I think you're right that it doesn't really matter what the genre or subgenre is. It's the dramatic tension of setup and of creating expectations that you're waiting for the author to pay off. And that's what can carry you through a story. Because I'll be honest, most horror stories, horror books, horror movies, they don't scare me per se. I'm maybe just a little too jaded, but I'm still along for the ride because I want to know what's going to happen next.
I do think that this grew out of my journalism background to a certain degree because so much of news production, whether it's print or for broadcast, is about engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to get the audience, we'll just use a broad term audience, in order to get the audience engaged, there has to be some level of suspense or mystery. So if you think about like headlines that you see, the headline may raise a question or create a question in your mind, but it doesn't actually give you the answer because you need to click on it to find out. Or you're watching a broadcast and they have the headline story, this big story, but they tease it to the
Right.
end of the broadcast because they want you to watch everything else and then hang on until the end of the news hour to watch this one story that everyone has been waiting for. And so I think that that sensibility has always been there, that in order to keep people engaged with the material and to learn what it is that you came to, in a way, teach, they have to be engaged with it. They're just going to put it down, they're going to change the channel, or they're not going to click that link.
Tamika, you just blew my mind. I know we've sort of all been parodying the news and clickbait for a while now. We sort of know how reality TV works and all these things that are designed to keep us watching. But in journalism school, is there some kind of conflict or tension or embarrassment about the fact that you are just trying to deliver the information in an unbiased way and let people make their own determination while also learning how to constantly tease out stories and create hooks and keep people clicking and reading, which is the opposite of just getting the info they need?
Well, there's a balance there too, because you have the journalism, you have the facts and the information, but you also have the art of it. And in order for there to be art, there has to be some sort of engagement. No
Mm.
one's going to go to a gallery to look at something that is just not interesting to them because there's so many other things that people can do. Where I saw the tension, I think, was when decisions were being made in putting together, the arc of the news hour that were more led by advertisers and
Mm-hmm.
less by news engagement. I didn't see a tension when the point of it was to keep viewers or listeners engaged with the material, because you want to have an informed democracy. And in order to have an informed democracy, you have to give them the information. And you're not going to be able to give it to them if they turn off your station.
And there's such a fire hose of headlines and articles and listicles that are sort of trying to snag our attention that if a headline is written too well, I know I'm guilty of this. I'll just glance at the headline and I'll be like, got it. Don't need to click through. Don't need to see the story. Don't need to learn what the nuance is. Whatever's been boiled down to 3 to 5 words, because I ain't got time to slow down and read every article that I see.
Right. And you may be missing so much nuance in the story by not
Mhm.
clicking on it. That's the danger in writing a headline that gives away too much, right? You do want people to click on it to at least read the lead and the first few paragraphs of the story to have a sense of the premise and where it's headed and continue to read, hopefully, if they've been engaged enough to keep going.
We really need to shut down the internet, I think. I think it's just destroyed our attention spans in such a
No,
hideous way.
as someone, when I went to school and certainly when I started working, I felt that I was a multimedia journalist, and I was certainly described that way in the beginning when I began because I worked across all media. So I had done some print, I had done broadcast, and I certainly worked a lot online. I was a web producer for a PBS show. And I really love what the internet and social media has done for distribution. It has flattened distribution so information can get out amongst people without having to go through the legacy channels all the time. And I think within the indie horror world, that has been the lifeblood of indie horror, and everyone is not going to be traditionally published by Penguin Random House and Simon and Schuster and Hachette. And some people will be published. I certainly was published by small presses. And the way for me to get information out about my publication was to go through social media channels and to get my message out to people without necessarily going through the New York Times, because there was no way to go through the New York Times when you're published by a small horror press. They're not going to review your book. And so I know that we have an issue with attention span. I think it's more about screen time and less about the internet specifically. I think it's just screen time in general. But I champion social media and the internet because I worked in legacy media, and I know, well, we're starting to see what happens to legacy media when there's pressure from the top, when there's pressure from the government, or when there's pressure from advertisers and corporate entities to shut down messages. You kind of need that other way to distribute and get information out.
I feel like legacy media had its own problems of perverse incentives and ideological capture from advertisers. That created the 24-hour news cycle, which was incredibly damaging to all journalism. So then we moved to new media, which had a golden era, which I think you and I both got to experience, where you actually could flatten that playing field and distribute your things and get indie projects out. And now that has also been captured to the point where it's just algorithms and botnets and rage farms that you can't really get a huge reach distributing things online or through social media anymore. I mean, if you've looked at the metrics and the return on ads and marketing campaigns and things like that, people who had built really solid followings on the main social media platforms are just floundering now. Now there's a few influencers on TikTok or BookTok, and everyone else is just sort of blowing dandelion seeds into the wind. Perhaps I'm cynical.
I think it depends on your goals. I know my goals going into the process of becoming an indie author was to build community.
Mm-hmm.
And community doesn't necessarily mean huge or big. Followings doesn't mean influencer, but it does mean that I connect with readers. And I feel that I would not be able to connect with the readers that I have so far if it hadn't have been for the online community and the spaces that I've been in. I show up to in-person events, and some people come up to me to purchase a copy of my book and to get me to sign it. And we have a conversation, and I discover that they knew about the event because I had shared that event on my social media. I don't have a huge following, but I did make a connection with that person who came out. or I'll get a, direct message from someone who picked up my book and they were already following me, which is how they knew about it. And then they'll write me a note to tell me what they thought about it. And it's in my social media DMs. And I think that's community. That's important to me, is being able to build a community with the readers that I have, to make them feel that I understand them and I'm writing with them in mind, to get feedback from them, to hear what they think, to answer the questions that they have. And I know that I, as an indie author, would not have been able to do that up until this point if it hadn't have been for my social media handles.
That was incredibly graceful, and I concede the point.
I think your point stands. Your point definitely stands. I know that I use these tools for different reasons. I'm not necessarily looking to have a huge following. That's great, but I'm more interested in connection around my work.
But you can hear my rant anywhere. I think what we need to hear is what you're saying about the community building aspect and the quality over quantity. I think that was very well said.
Thank you.
All right. So speaking of that book, let's get into this collection, UNSHOD, Cackling, and Naked. These are short stories, so we're not going to give too much away. The story that I would like to start with is the first in the collection, The Turn.
Yes. The collection is, in a nutshell, a series of stories in which the oppressed, the labeled, the marginalized, the outcasts have come into their power and begin to understand what has been done to them, and they push back against it in some way. And so in The Turn, it is narrated by someone who has a very strong opinion about people's relationship with their pets, particularly their dogs, and has a viewpoint about the ways in which we have domesticated dogs and incorporated them into our families as if they are a family member, and we wear them on our chests when they're puppies, and we push them in strollers, and we dress them up in human-like clothes. And the dogs decide in this story that they no longer want to be pets. They no longer agree to this hierarchy. There's a little back and forth about what may have caused it, but it's called The Turn because they turn on their owners. And without giving too much away, I think it always comes up when I have discussions with people, because we make so many assumptions about the hierarchy that we have created with animals on our planet. And that in the idea of dominion, that means that everything that is not human must come to heel. And a lot of times our dominion over animals and over the earth is violent. And so those are the issues that I'm raising in that story, hoping that people can look at their pets in a different way, but more so to look at our treatment of the planet and the ways in which we as people, but also the dominant culture within our country, believes that whatever its thought is on a thing is the way that it should be.
I really want you to write a collection, or at least a short story, called Everything That Is Not Human Must Come to Heel. That is an incredible turn of phrase.
Let me write that down. I agree. I like that.
If you say so yourself.
Yeah.
There's all this interesting stuff about dogs and animals and that relationship, which again is sort of a forecast into other stories in the collection. For me, the beating heart of the story was your main character is in this sort of situationship. she's in an on again, off again relationship with this boyfriend who can't commit. And it was so interesting to see that play out alongside this tension between the dogs and whether or not they were going to stay or go or turn on their quote unquote owners.
So L. Reynolds, the narrator, makes a decision that I think was crucial to the story, and it did involve their boyfriend. And Elle realizes that their neighbor is in trouble. And I thought that this was a central question to the story. Do I save myself or do I help someone in my community? Elle Reynolds decides that there's no argument around this. We're saving the neighbor. Their boyfriend doesn't agree, but goes along for the very reason that they are not in the best place in their relationship. They kind of have been on again, off again, and he's really trying to show Elle that he has changed. And so he goes along with Elle's plan. But Elle begins to realize as things don't work out the way that they had thought, that maybe they had made the wrong decision. And actually later begins to wish that they could take that decision back. The reason why that was important to me is because I feel like that is so much of the tension of everything that we are dealing with in this country and have been politically for a while is, do I go off and save myself? Do I focus on myself? This is the human condition, right? Do I focus on myself? Do I isolate myself? Do I do what's best for me? Am I going to give myself self-care? Am I going to be selfish? Or am I going to focus on other people, the community, my neighbor? Even within this relationship, Elle with their boyfriend, there is a certain level of a microcosm of that because they want to protect their heart, but then they also want to love this person. And so I think you raise an interesting point about how this subplot is running along the bigger one, but they are kind of hand in hand. Do I focus on my heart, my well-being, myself, or do I make myself vulnerable in order to be in connection with someone else?
There's so much to unpack there. It was a great story to open the collection with, to sort of get these wheels turning in the reader's mind.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting because I wrote that story and I put that story first in the collection because it was one of my most rejected stories.
Oh, wow.
I thought it was interesting, and I didn't know if it was because of the dogs specifically. People have very strong feelings about their dogs, and I have heard a lot of people after this collection came out about, you know, it not bad, I would say, but just this feeling of it was uncomfortable. Because they would never want to see that, because it challenges the idea that your dog loves you and that your dog loves your family. It challenges the idea that your dog wants to be, you know, a part of your home and wants to take your last name and wear these clothes and, you know, eat the food that you buy at the grocery store.
There's such a weighted sentence that your dog wants to take your last name. That scream echoes throughout this collection in so many ways, on so many levels. That's fantastic. You know, it's interesting. I write short stories, and I find that there are some short stories that are extremely precious to me, not in a way that I wouldn't accept criticism or editing of them, but just that they really feel like as close to a true expression of my interests and my voice. And a lot of times those are ones that get rejected, whereas some stories that are a little more approachable or accessible, a little more middle of the road, might have an easier time getting picked up. But I find that something like The Turn, which you say was so oft rejected, it really does cut straight through all of your interests, or at least the themes that you wanted to explore with this collection, and that it's such a strong example of your storytelling.
I think the thing that doesn't get expressed explicitly, but people find out about me later, is that I'm a plant-based eater.
Mm.
And I don't eat meat, and I haven't for a really long time. And there are a few stories in the collection, that tie into that theme. One of them is And We Scream, where the main character, there's a whole scene in there with her father sort of just, killing animals. But these are like farm animals that they're killing to eat. And her interaction with her father, but also just with the meat and what that means to take another animal into your body when you have seen it killed to go into your body is a certain horror, for that character. So I think that there is a thread, and I think that it is very personal, to your point. And those are I agree that those are sometimes the ones that don't get picked up.
Mm.
But they also do resonate with readers. So maybe some of these editors don't know everything.
Or they recognize that perhaps as a standalone sort of shot in the dark, it's maybe a little too hard to access. Patrick Barb beats this drum, which is there's a lot of stories that only work in a collection. And I think having a story like this that can almost set a thesis statement for everything to follow is the perfect place for it, because you can keep ruminating on these ideas as you read the other stories and see it reflected and see all the variations on these ideas. Whereas as a standalone between the pages of a magazine or something, it may not get the space it needs.
That's an interesting thought. I think I would need to ponder that some more. I think if a short story is successful, it should stand on its own.
Mm-hmm.
That was my initial reaction, but I think I would have to think about that some more, because I think that I have a lot of respect for Patrick Barb. So if he said it,
if he said it, it's worth listening to. Yeah.
Right. I got to take some time to think about it.
Yeah. So there are two stories that seem very closely related. I don't know if you want to tackle them both at the same time or sort of compare contrast them, but you have Under the Crown and Mannequin Model.
Yes. So Mannequin Model is the story that the collection's title and the cover art are pulled from. And those stories are very much in conversation with each other. Mm-hmm. They grew out of experiences that I had both modeling and in pageants. And for I'd say first maybe 20 something years of my life, I was involved in the entertainment industry in front of the camera and never questioned it, just because it was how life had always been for me. I started as young as 4. And so it wasn't until I got to college that I started to consider the fashion industry, the pageant industry, the beauty industry, the anti-aging sub-industry of the beauty industry, and started to pick apart some of the ideas that had been placed in my mind. Some of the thoughts that I had, that I thought about myself and about women and about my role and place in the world, were for the first time being challenged by the education that I was receiving at Columbia. And so these characters are coming to the realization that what they have accepted up until this point is really not okay. And that because of that, they are not okay. And they both go through a mental and emotional transformation in their stories. In the case of Under the Crown, she is on stage and she is winning a pageant, which is everything that her mother has wanted her to do. Her mother is really abusive in this story emotionally. And then it turns, by the end, she's physically abusive as well. And her mother is really a stand-in for the patriarchy in this story, which is interesting because it's a woman, right? Mm-hmm. But the forces that work against us don't need the people who created them to do its bidding. So you can have institutional racism can exist and the patriarchy can exist and white supremacy, all these things can exist, but the patriarchy doesn't need men. It could very well, the patriarchy could be coming out of your mother's mouth. And so that's what has been happening to her is her mother has been molding her into like a beauty pageant all-star, really. Like she almost can't lose a pageant because she's so polished and she's so good. But the dress that she's placed in is literally cutting into her flesh. Like the beating on the dress, it is almost like the dress is alive and it's cutting into her. And it's this moment when she has already won the crown and needs to make a speech that she starts to have this transformation. In Mannequin Model, she's on a platform between two mannequins, and she is supposed to be posing as a mannequin herself, wearing a dress that is a couple of sizes too small for her as a college student, but she's behind the glass storefront of the store that's hired her. And people are coming by hurling insults at her, just talking about how she's a tramp, she's all the awful words that we say about women in their sensuality, and that she deserves everything. One person even sticks out his tongue and kind of like makes these very lewd gestures towards her. And she begins to break, as does the other character with the dress on her. They both begin to break. And the thing that emerges in both of them is very raw, becomes, in one case, violent. The beauty pageant one I don't see as violent. I think she's ripping apart the labels and all of the constrictures on her. In Mannequin Model, she's violent. She becomes violent because she has been sexually abused in her youth. And by the end, the person who emerges, is left up to the reader who they are becoming. Are they becoming grotesque? Are they becoming monsters? Is this an origin story for someone who's going to go on to do horrid things? Or is this the breaking down of societal constraints and they're going to become something more themselves or more beautiful? And I think I left that open in both of them, but I have heard that readers have connected with it. And those are the stories that I think is the reason that the book gets called feminist horror so much, is because they really are pushing back against the patriarchy, but also against the violence that has been done to them.
It's so wild that you talk about societal constraints, because when in the Mannequin Model, when this college student is on one side of the glass, on the mannequin side of the glass, people are just walking by uninterested. They're not reacting to the plaster mannequins at all. But as soon as they suspect that it might be a real woman that's there for them to look at, who's on display, who's just displaying swimwear or, fashion, they have no societal constraints. They immediately go into jeering and leering and sexist remarks and harassment. And she is not allowed to react or move or blink. Even if there's sweat in her eyes and her muscles are cramping, she just has to stand there and do her job. She's a starving college student. She's happy to take this gig where, she's essentially modeling, and the crowd forms and is almost rabid at the thought that they can do whatever they want on their side of the glass. So there's no societal constraints there.
And it mimics so much what happens to women on social media, but also women in public spaces, because women don't own public space, men own public spaces. And so one of the things that we teach our young women and our girls is to not react when you are on a street and someone is catcalling or yelling at you or saying crude things, because there is the potential that they could turn violent and they could harm you. And so you do have to be like a mannequin when these things occur. You cannot yell back at them. You cannot, give them the finger. You can't tell them to go F themselves, which is what you really want to say. And the same for a beauty pageant is no matter what's going on around you or how you're feeling, you have to continue to smile. You cannot let your smile falter. And I think that we have made it so that we can say whatever we want to women. We have made it in this society where a woman can be objectified, but also harmed without there being any restraint. We can go on social media and see a photo of a woman and just put whatever we want in the comments. We can just say whatever we want because who's going to stop us? Who's going to say that that's not how we treat another human being?
So this collection takes its name from this story with the line unshod, cackling, and naked. Can you break that down for us? Because naked, it would seem, would also cover unshod, but it's important that this woman is unshod and naked and, more to the point, cackling.
In the beginning of the story, when she exits the train to go to the mall, she sees a woman that she judges. And this woman is, and this comes up a lot in my stories where the character will see someone that they are nothing like. And by the end, they have almost become that person. And this woman is just a woman that you see on the streets of New York, if you've ever, walked through Manhattan, who is, people probably aren't even noticing her when they go by because they just think the woman is out of her mind. The police are going to come sweep her up, swoop her off. Like no one's going to have to deal with her because she's not wearing any clothes, she's not wearing any shoes. She's. And so by the end, Zenobia is, she's not wearing shoes. And unshod is so important. I think unshod is actually more important than naked because where are the places that we go without our shoes on? We are at home usually when we don't have on our shoes. If we see someone out in public without their shoes on, we may have a certain thought about them, particularly if they're, going a great distance in a public place and the ground is dirty or there's, there could be cracked glass. And so she's not wearing her shoes. She's on the street. She has turned into this woman, but she's also come home. She's also come home to herself. And I thought that it was important that she's not wearing her shoes because she's finally taken them off. She's finally returned to who she was. She's cackling because she's gone a little mad. She's gone a little mad in that moment.
And cackling is a very gendered word as well.
Yeah, I mean, because that's what we think of women, right? We almost don't like the sound of women's voices unless they're serving us. We don't like the sound of women's joy. We don't like the sound of women cackling with their friends, having a good time. If we hear a woman's voice, we want her to be navigating our GPS, telling us where to go. We want her to be, Alexa and Siri and all of these. We don't want to hear a woman cackling and having a good time. We don't want her to have joy or pleasure. She's having that in this moment, regardless of what it means. And she's naked because not only has she taken off the clothes that she was hired to wear, but she's taken off the label that the society had put on her. She's taken off the label that the men were yelling at her behind that glass. She cracks the glass. She walks over the glass barefoot, which is the image that Eddie Generous created for the cover. She has done away with the man, the final man who was yelling all of these things at her. And she's become the woman that she judged, which I find so important in this story because she was part of that system that judged that woman when the story began, but she has become that woman by the end. She's no longer part of the system.
Yeah, it's almost the perfect story to end the podcast on, but we're not going to. We're going to keep going. You've been to LA, you've been to New York. They both make appearances in the collection, but Detroit, I feel, is the real star of this book. Do you want to talk just a little bit about Detroit and what that means to your characters and to your writing?
Yeah, Detroit is everything. Detroit is everything. Detroit is me. I grew up in Detroit at a time when it was often described as one of the murder capitals of the country. It was at the height of the crack epidemic. There was a lot of crime. It was a very dangerous place. I survived a carjacking attempt when I was a teenager, and there was a lot of law enforcement and police activity in my neighborhood because there were drug traffickers in my neighborhood, and I lost family members to to violence and to gun violence in particular. We lost family friends to gun violence. And it shows up in this collection, but also in the book that I have, my debut novel that's coming out next year. Is not set in Detroit, but it is set in a fictional place in Michigan that very much resembles Detroit and Flint, Michigan. The life that I lived for my first 18 years before I left home to go off to college had so much violence and destruction, but also so much community and beauty and joy and happiness and growth. And I return to it because I think it is a microcosm of the country. I think Detroit represents so much of what has gone right and what has gone wrong in this country. And I will say, when I was growing up, I lived in Detroit, but I went to a Catholic school in Dearborn. And it's a small town, right next to Detroit. And it was a small Catholic school, but it was multicultural. The Everyone that was there came from some sort of different background. But one of the things that I grew up with was that the black and white nature of racial relations within the town was ever present. But when I interacted with a lot of my friends, we interacted on the ethnic level. So what that means is I was African American, and one of my friends was Mexican American, and another was Polish American, and another was German American. And so, like, the Polish Americans friend, we would go to their house to have pierogies. Or there was a sense that we were all working class, and we had all come to the country from somewhere, and we had ancestors that were back somewhere. We had some sort of mother country. And it put us all on a bit of an even playing field in our interactions with one another. And I think that colored a lot of my characters, where race only becomes an issue when it is made an issue. Mm-hmm. And so the characters very much feel that they are just living in their community. They're just in their community with their people. And race only becomes an issue when the cop shows up and the cop happens to not be also black. Because if a black cop shows up, it may be a little bit of a different interaction. I think that that's why Detroit is so important to my stories, is because it remains so important to me, and I carry that place inside of me everywhere I go.
Tamika, what are you working on next?
My debut novel, The Curse of Hester Gardens, is coming out in spring of 2026. It is a Gothic novel that is set in a public housing project where a mother has 3 sons, and she is facing the twin specters of a supernatural curse and gun violence in America. That's in the spring of 2026, in March. And so I have pre-order links up at my website. I am on the edge of my seat for the cover reveal. And I wake up every day and I wonder if this is real, because I'm finally telling the story that I think has been inside of me for so long. I spent years researching gun violence and youth violence in America, and it's finally going to be out there. And I'm already starting to have conversations about it as a social issue, which I think we need to have a conversation about.
And where can people find you and find community with you online?
The best place to get information on me is at my website, TamikaThompson.com. I'm on all the socials, and so I have them all on there. You could just kind of click through and follow. I also have a newsletter and I have a blog, both of which I update regularly, called Tamika Talks Terror. And in addition to doing podcasts, I do go out to do in-person events a lot, honestly. There's a very vibrant, independent horror community that has welcome me with open arms. And I feel that I get my messages out there and can get my books out there pretty regularly. And I enjoy doing that.
Tamika, this was great. Thank you for hanging out with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and follow. We're now on YouTube. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.